Hi, I'm John Papola, and you're listening to the Emergent Order podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I really dive deep into the world of money and macroeconomics, especially in the backdrop of this coronavirus crisis that we're all going through, with economist Scott Sumner. Scott is the director of the program on monetary policy at the Mercatus Center. Scott is also the author of the blog The Money Illusion, and he's an economist that really has helped shape the way I understand what happens in the macroeconomy. How does the Fed's behavior interact with what we see in the world? How should we think about things like interest rates and inflation and quantitative easing and all these things we hear about in the media now, again, unfortunately, 10 years after we first became fixated on them in the 2008 and 9 financial crisis. So with that, I hope you enjoy and hope you have the wherewithal for this very long conversation with economist Scott Sumner. So, Scott Sumner, I am excited to be talking to you because when I first started getting interested in macroeconomics back during the financial crisis, I really started the journey with sort of popularizations of Hayek and these ideas of business cycle theories, and I just kept going down the rabbit hole. But I quickly came across this idea of stabilizing nominal GDP. And that led me to your blog. And your blog has been maybe my single most frequented economics blog over the long haul over the past decade. So I appreciate you coming on and talking to me about everything that's happening.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
I what I'm hoping we could do, because our episodes here cover a pretty broad range of subjects, and you're the first monetary economist to come on, is to take a step way back, and I'm going to try to put myself in that beginner's mind and just ask basic questions and build us back up to this macro picture and what's going on in the world right now on March 20th, 2020, where the particular day matters a lot with the pace of the news cycle. Um, what is money? What is it?
That's a good question. So, the textbook definition gives you, I guess, three roles: medium of exchange, unit of account, store of value. I guess there's differences of opinion on how to define money, but from my perspective, the role that's really important is what you might call the medium of account. That is, it's the thing in which prices are denominated. Okay. So in the US dollar is what we use to measure values. And although money has other roles like, say, store of value, there's lots and lots of other stores of value. So it's not a particularly distinctive role of money to say it's a store of value. What really makes money distinctive is that other things are priced in terms of money, not apples or oranges or ounces of gold. Although at one time, of course, gold was the way prices were measured. So because prices and wages and debt contracts and all of that stuff are priced in money terms, that's why money is important. So then I would define money as the asset in which other things are priced in terms of.
Now, what about the medium of exchange? We use money to buy and sell things instead of bartering. Help me understand, if I'm coming into this conversation totally cold, that's probably the use that people most readily
Right.
understand.
And it's I think one of the reasons is the use as a medium of exchange is really closely linked to its use as a medium of account. That is, we find it convenient to use money to buy things, basically because the price of money is fixed, right? A dollar is always a dollar. So it's a very convenient medium of account. You could imagine a scenario where the medium of account and the medium of exchange were two different things, right? You measured prices in terms of, I don't know, gold or something, and then you used some medium of exchange that had a value that fluctuated in terms of gold. But we don't usually do that. We usually use the same thing as a medium of exchange to buy other goods as we do to measure prices, right? So I don't know if this distinction is clear. Other things that some people might regard as money, like say a treasury bill, I don't regard as money because it's not a medium of account. We don't price things in terms of treasury bills. We price things in terms of US dollars. But
So
um, basically, in the US, the two roles, medium of account, that is how we measure this, and medium of exchange, the thing we use to buy goods and services, are basically the same.
the where where does money come from? The I you hear the stories of people in prison who start to use cigarettes
Cigarettes,
to
right?
to, to exchange goods and services in prison.
Right.
Um, so there's these properties that um, make up money. I mean, most of us think of money in terms of, well, it's what the treasury prints, it's US dollars, and that's the only legal medium of exchange is US dollar. But
Hmm.
the money predates that, right? So,
Right.
to really be super basic, like how should we think of that almost elemental money as an invention of people?
Right. So people, maybe through some Hayekian process, fixed on one particular good as being useful as a medium of exchange and a way of measuring prices. And as you know, throughout history, different commodities were often used. When you get into more modern times, usually gold or silver was chosen as the commodity that served as money. And then there was kind of an interesting transition. So there was a period where, further back in history, people actually used metal types of coins and so on in exchange. Over time, gradually, we evolved a system where gold continued to be the medium of account, but we often used paper currency that was backed by gold for everyday transactions because it was more convenient. And the ratio between the currency and the gold was fixed under the gold standard. So a dollar bill was a promise to pay so much gold on demand. So we kind of had, in a sense, a dual monetary system for quite some time, where both you could think of money either as gold or as currency notes. And then when we became dissatisfied with the gold standard for various reasons, we started to move away from gold. And since there were already currency notes circulating that were backed by gold, we found it convenient to just start using those currency notes as money and drop the gold backing. So we sort of stumbled into this fiat money system one step at a time. There wasn't really a plan, at least initially, to do it that way, but it worked out that way. And once we um, went to fiat money, then essentially the value of money became determined by the supply and demand. There's a demand for it because it's useful in transaction. There's a certain supply determined by the government, and then the interaction of those determine the value of money. Whereas under the previous commodity system, the value was partly based on the value of the metal, gold or silver as a commodity. Although even there, because gold was widely used to back up money, its monetary value also played a big role in determining its value, not just its usefulness in jewelry and so on.
Yeah, this is interesting. So this uh, the money, just taking gold. So the way I understand it is the benefits of gold is that it's uniform and it's scarce and it's divisible, so you can melt it down into different sized coins and or bars and have them be equal in weight, and so you can use that kind of weight. That's why like the English pound is called a pound for a reason.
Right.
But that
Pound sterling.
interaction, yeah, but that interaction between the value of the let's stay on gold for a second. The value of gold for its use as jewelry or as a conductive metal versus its value as that medium of account where I go out and use use a whatever the unit was, $1 worth of gold. How did those two things interact? Because you've got this thing, US dollars, you can't really do anything else with. It's just paper. So you don't have that interaction between, well, there's some other use for this thing that we use for exchange. How did that interaction work when it was a commodity? Like what did that mean that you could effectively have money used for something else?
Well, I think you could sort of like do a thought experiment where you go back to a barter system, and then you have, essentially many different objects that are used to purchase other goods and services. And then it becomes convenient to pick just one. You mentioned prison camps where they chose cigarettes as convenient. And so societies gradually over time picked one. There's certain network externalities, I think you'd say, a sort of convenience associated with a single type of money. Just as we sort of socially agree on one language to communicate and so on. And once that's done, then the commodity sort of has a dual purpose. So if silver was chosen as money, then silver continued to be used for industrial purposes, but is also used for money. And you have silver coins and so on. But then once you get to that point, you can easily create other means of exchange that are backed by silver to economize on the use of silver, and like currency that's backed by silver. And so there's sort of a natural progression where you start with barter. You move to a system where one commodity is chosen as a medium of account because it's convenient to have a single way of measuring prices. Then you adopt a system where you use both metal coins and paper money backed by that metal because it's more convenient to do it that way than just use metal coins as money, and so on. And then, as I said, more recently, you get into a scenario where you start to drop the metallic aspect of the monetary system and just go with the paper money.
So I think most people that are familiar at all with this idea that there was once a gold standard or money backed by a precious metal, they'll say, well, see, now our money doesn't have any value. It's not backed by anything. But when it was backed by this shiny metal, well, that was real. And now the money's not real. What's
Well,
true about that and what's false about that?
I guess I think that's sort of false. I mean, I think it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. When you say they think it has no value, I think what you mean is they think it has no intrinsic value.
Right.
Obviously, $100 bill has value because you can go out and buy things with it. But I presume they mean no intrinsic value, and it has no value outside of its use as money. Now, some people would argue that gold has relatively little value other than the fact that people consider it valuable. I mean, it does have some value as, I guess, jewelry and so on. But even under the gold standard, gold's value was mostly due to its acceptance as money. Without that, its value would have been much, much lower.
Yeah, this notion that I think there's something about just the like the physical qualities like of gold that make this feel like there's something more solid or something more real than this paper that's printed that, you know, is only valuable because it's printed by the government in a particular way and is accepted. But I guess
But that's true to some extent. That's true of gold. I mean, you say it's a solid metal, but so is copper and zinc and iron, and those don't have very much value. It's I think when you really look closely at gold, its value is because other people think it's value. You can have a gold necklace, and people will look up to you. They think you're wealthy, so on. So it's sort of a psychological thing, and the same is true of currency. I mean, I suppose there's some differences. With currency, if the government issuing it collapses, it has no value, whereas a gold coin would have value if you had to flee to another country. So I don't mean to suggest they're identical, but I mean, you can kind of think of it this way. Let's just think of the total stock of paper money in an economy as a sort of like capital stock. That is, it's useful in a physical sense of facilitating transactions. And if we didn't have that stock of money, our economy would be less efficient because it'd be harder to make transactions, right? So it's a little bit like say motor oil plays in an automobile. I mean, motor oil doesn't make the car move. You need, gasoline and engines and all that to make the car move, but it sort of smooths out the frictions in the automobile, in the engine. And, at first approximation, money doesn't really cause any wealth to produce. I mean, we need real resources, labor, capital, land, and so on. Money merely facilitates transactions, but still that's an important role. So by doing that, it has a certain value to society, and that value is probably roughly its face value. So if in America currency is a little less than $2 trillion, then maybe that currency stock has about 2 trillion in net present value of facilitating transactions over time. That's how much people value it at, because they're willing to hold that much wealth in the form of currency, which earns no interest. Now, I know there's not much interest to be earned anyway today, but when interest rates were 5%, people held a lot of currency despite earning no interest because they felt it was convenient for their transactions purposes. So, I mean, a stock of paper money does have real value associated with it. If it's well managed, it can be used in transactions. And it's not that different from gold, maybe slightly different because of, as what I said, it sort of requires the government producing it to continue existing, to provide some sort of backing.
Or not produce too much of it.
I mean, there was even a case in, I think, Somalia or someplace like that where the government collapsed and people kept using the currency out of habit for a while. I don't know the details of that story, but that does illustrate that I think it has some value, and there's a lot of debate about why it has value. I have certain opinions on that, but it certainly has usefulness in transactions.
So, one of the other things that I hear, and that is often gets embodied in the occasional viral sort of message or video, or is this idea that money is debt. I don't fully understand where this comes from, but it's something that seems to be more from sort of the syndicalist or the sort of more academic left. But what is that? What have you heard this concept? I imagine you have this notion that money is debt. Like, what does that mean? Like the idea that, well, if we pay off all our debt, the money will go away. I don't know where that comes from. Can you explain that to me?
Right. So,
even if it's fallacy, what is the fallacy? I'm not even sure I understand what the fallacious claim is that's being made.
I've generally not regarded money as debt, but I think it's a little bit of a debatable point, if you will. If money was gold, if we were back on the gold standard, I don't think it would make any sense to view gold as debt. But what about paper money issued by a government? So To me, it's a little bit analogous to the question of whether our Social Security obligations are a debt that the federal government has that's comparable to treasury bonds, which are clearly a government debt. And some people will say the Social Security obligations are a debt because we have to pay future benefits to people. Others will say, no, it's not really a debt because there's no legal obligation to pay any amount of Social Security. It's just we'll pay whatever Congress wants to pay over time. And you could say money's a little bit like that. Like if a central bank issues a lot of money, say during a financial crisis, and if in the long run that would produce a lot of inflation, if not later pulled out of circulation, then you could say, well, it's sort of like a debt if we think there's an implicit government promise to keep inflation at a low level. And if you think there's no implicit government promise to keep inflation low, then they could just print the money and it's not a debt. They could leave it out there forever and we would just suffer from the inflation tax. So whether you view money as debt, I think, is a little bit like how you view Social Security obligations.
I want to make sure I understand that because so there's an old video that talked that included this, but I've heard others like I think David Graeber and other sort of not monetary economists generally, but macro sort of political commentators have often talked about this. I think the way they've sometimes talked about it is, well, the way our system issues money is by buying treasury bonds. And so there's this kind of debt. Our money is backed by debt, that without the debt of without treasury bond debt, there wouldn't be any money. Or that,
well,
this
that's the
might
way
be,
we do it,
yeah.
but we don't have to do it that way. We could just give it away or something. There's other ways to inject money into the economy. And it wouldn't even have to be given away. We could inject it through some method that we already are engaged in, like we could pay government salaries with newly created what's called base money, currency and bank reserves. And we don't typically do it that way. The Fed does buy bonds, issues new money as the money stock, but it's not the only way of doing that. I don't think that's really the decisive factor with debt. Let me go back to this example of issuing a lot of money when there's a financial crisis and a high demand for liquidity. As you probably know, in quote normal times when interest rates are positive, if the government issues an enormous amount of money, it can create hyperinflation, right? And we've seen this in Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and other places.
Yep. The Weimar Republic.
So, yeah, and numerous other examples, and even over long periods of time in Brazil, Argentina, and so on. There's enormous amount of data that suggests that when interest rates are positive, flooding the economy with lots of currency creates a lot of inflation. Now, you can argue that when interest rates are zero and there's a high demand for liquidity, you can, for a short period of time, inject a lot of money in the economy without creating a lot of inflation. But implicit in that is the assumption that if we go back to normal and interest rates go back above zero, you'd have to pull that money out of circulation, that extra money, or else you'd get a lot of inflation. And if your attitude was, well, we'll just have the inflation, we don't care, then clearly that money is not a debt to the federal government. They're not going to pay it off at any point. They're just going to put it out there. And if it loses value, that's tough luck for the people holding money. But if the government has a commitment to, say, 2% inflation, there might be an obligation to remove some of that money from circulation to keep inflation down at 2% once the crisis is over. And or another way of doing that, and this gets even closer to your debt example, is they could keep the money in circulation and start paying interest on it so that people hold the money and it doesn't create a lot of inflation. And to some extent, that's what the Fed did in this QE program in the Great Recession. So they injected a lot of reserves. When we got out of the crisis in 2015 and 2016 and interest rates started rising above zero, Normally, all that extra money would create a lot of inflation. Well, instead, they paid interest on bank reserves. They paid interest to the banks to just sort of sit on the money, and they kept raising the interest rate they paid to banks so that all that extra money in circulation wouldn't create the inflation that it really would have if they weren't paying interest. Now, if you think of those interest payments on bank reserves, that's kind of like debt, right? The Fed is having to pay interest on this money they've injected into the economy. When they
It's
first injected it, the interest rates were close to zero, so it wasn't really very noticeable. But as the interest rates get higher, then it becomes clear that it is actually a debt if there's a commitment to keep inflation low. Again, with no commitment, like in Zimbabwe or someplace like that, it's not effectively a debt. It's just like an inflation tax on the public.
so before we move on to inflation, I want to make sure I understand. When I think of a debt at a fundamental level, a debt has a creditor. So if I have if I make a loan to somebody, they are now in debt to me. They have to pay me back, maybe with interest, maybe not, but they have an obligation to return the money that I've lent them, and or vice versa. If I go to the bank and borrow $100,000 to build a house, over time I have to pay that back. That's debt.
Right.
And in the case you're describing, in terms of thinking about money as debt, I have a stack of $100,000 in cash. In what way in the world you're describing do I, as the holder, that current holder of that pile of cash, have an obligation to return it to someone?
Okay, good question. Let's go back to the gold standard and think about how paper money was debt in that case. And then we'll go up to the recent example. So under the gold standard, if you had a $100 bill, at that time you viewed it like a modern person would view a check that someone gave them. So
Right.
today, if you get a check from someone, you might take it to the bank and say, I hope this check is good. I hope to get some real money for this check. I hope to be able to cash it in and get some currency. Well, 100 years ago, if you had currency, your attitude might be, I hope this currency is good. I hope I can take it to the government and get the amount of gold that's promised on the currency note. So essentially, the currency note 100 years ago was an obligation for the government to pay you a certain amount of gold on demand. Do you see what I
Right.
mean? So in that sense, a currency note was a type of debt.
Or in the case of the pre-central bank era, just the private banks. So I
Private
know that.
banks, the same thing, right?
So for
Exactly.
people that aren't familiar with this, back before the Fed or the central bank in Canada in particular, which had this longer, um, there were banknotes. They looked like money, but they were literally like a Wells Fargo banknote, $100 with Wells Fargo's name on it, and it was basically like Scott is saying, you would take it to a Wells Fargo bank. They would give you $100 in gold if you wanted that gold, but you would also more likely use it to spend, and it would end up, maybe you would pay a worker with it, and that worker maybe didn't bank at Wells Fargo. They maybe banked at a different bank, and they would go deposit that banknote at their bank, and that bank would then get the gold from Wells Fargo, right? Is that how that worked? That there was sort of, it was like checks, but it was still very cash like in the way you could pay people with banknotes and they could deposit those
Mm-hmm.
banknotes in other banks. Am I explaining that correctly?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that, but I believe that's right. They could just use the currency in circulation, for transactions, and then if they wish, they could take it back to the issuing bank and get it converted into gold or silver, whatever the backing was.
So yeah, so in that case, those notes are redeemable.
Right.
they're still not quite like a debt, though, in a sense. I
Right.
mean, they are in a sense that they're redeemable into another form. They're convertible into another form, but
There's
it's
an
not the case,
let me
right?
put
There's
it
not,
this way.
yeah.
There,
Help me think about this.
well, I don't, again, it gets into semantics, I guess.
Sure.
There's definitely an obligation to sort of pay off that currency on demand. So if if people come back to the bank and issuing bank and ask for the currency note to be converted into gold, they have an obligation to do so. Um, Imagine a loan you made where you could call it back at any time. You loan someone $100 under the provision that you can get your money back from them whenever you ask for it. They would sort of be in debt to you, right? So you could go
Yeah.
to them at any time and say, I'd like the loan I gave you to be repaid. And you could ask them even to repay it in gold or something. So I do think there is a certain like debt like quality to that situation. But I mean, I suppose it's a matter of semantics. I wouldn't want to push that point too hard. To
Sure.
me, these questions are the real question is, well, what are the practical implications of the debate about whether currency is a form of debt? That to
And
me is more important than whether we want to call it debt or not.
yeah, I think that's going to become important when we talk about this monetary policy issues. But before we do, what is inflation? Like what does that word mean, and how does it happen?
Well, the standard definition of inflation is a rise in the price level, which is the rise in some sort of measure of the average price of goods and services. There's other definitions of inflation that have been used throughout history, but that's the one that sort of standard in the textbooks today. And again, the definitions are not important. If someone insists that inflation is like an increase in the money supply or a fall in the price of gold or some other metric, then I say, fine, well, let's just talk about that specific definition and what it implies. But the standard definition used in the textbooks is the rate of increase or decrease, if it's deflation, in a price index for a wide variety of goods and services, such as the consumer price index or one of the others. Now, in my view, there's no sort of underlying hard and fast concept that's measured there. So it makes no sense to ask, does the CPI accurately measure inflation? Because it's not clear what we're even trying to accurately measure. We've never really defined what we mean by a rise in the price of something, right? The only place we would have a fairly clear idea of what inflation meant is if you had some commodity that didn't change over time. But most commodities change over time. So it's a little bit fuzzy as to what we mean by a price increase for a car or a personal computer or, a telephone or something. Commodities where it's sort of clear what we're talking about are like 87 octane gasoline or things like that, where, it's pretty clear what we mean by a price change. Since we don't have a very clear concept of what prices mean, all of these measures of inflation will be sort of fuzzy concepts, that is, approximations. And there's no single right measure of inflation.
Yeah,
But
so
it's useful to talk about it in general terms, I think, as long as we're aware it's not precise.
I mean, because I feel like the two concepts that the average person hears about when they think when it comes to money or the Federal Reserve or anything about the subject of money is what's inflation, and prices going up and or going down, but mostly going up. And
Mm.
interest rates, what are interest rates doing? And are interest rates high or low? And does that mean that the Fed is printing a lot of money or not printing enough money or printing too much money? And one of the things I've learned from reading your work is, and I know you stand on the shoulders of giants like Milton Friedman in a lot of this, but that those relationships are not anywhere near what they're made out to be in the press. So we often hear, like we are right now, oh, well, the Fed is printing a lot of money and they're pushing interest rates down. But how should I think about this? Is maybe this opens up an impossibly complex way to answer this, but is there a relationship between inflation and interest rates? How should I think about that?
Yes, but the relationship is kind of complicated, and it's difficult to explain. I'll try my best. In the long run, there's often a positive correlation between inflation and interest rates. And when inflation is very high in a country, especially for a period of years, interest rates tend to be high. And that's because lenders demand a higher return to compensate for the loss of purchasing power due to inflation. And because borrowers are willing to pay a higher interest rate knowing that inflation will push up the value of the assets they invest in. So inflation and interest rates are definitely positively correlated over longer periods of time. For American listeners old enough to remember the 1970s, that was a good example of high inflation, high interest rates. On the other hand, there's a widespread perception that cutting interest rates is an easy money policy, and also a widespread perception that easy money leads to higher inflation. So if we start to think about that, it gets kind of confusing because, like, wait a minute, if low interest rates are an expansionary policy that should lead to high inflation, how does that match up with what I just said about inflation and interest rates being positively correlated?
Right. Because you hear
So,
Fed
right,
cuts rates and now we're worried about inflation taking off, or vice versa.
right. So which is, like, if we want high inflation, what do? Do we have the Fed raise interest rates to a high level because the two are correlated? Or do we have the Fed cut interest rates to a low level because we think that easy money will lead to more inflation? And believe it or not, there's still debate among economists about this point. I use the phrase never reason from a price change. We shouldn't even be talking about the effect of changes in interest rates, because it always depends on what is causing interest rates to change. So you said a moment ago that there's this perception that the Fed is pushing interest rates downward and printing a lot of money. I could rephrase that this way. My perception is that the Fed is following interest rates downward and injecting far too little money in the economy, even though it is increasing the money supply. So we have to be careful in interpreting all of these variables: money supply, interest rates, inflation, and we have to do so in context. We have to know why interest rates changed before we make any judgments about what it means. Now, in the recent cycle, the current crisis has depressed what economists call the equilibrium interest rate, the rate that would be appropriate to keep the economy in equilibrium in some sense, or to keep inflation stable at 2%. It can be defined in different ways, but whatever way you define the equal interest rate, it's almost certainly falling very, very sharply. And then with the delay, the Fed reduced its target interest rate. But I wouldn't call that the Fed pushing interest rates lower. I would call that the Fed following a collapse in market interest rates with a belated cut in their target interest. So that distinction's subtle, but it's important, and it's really hard for a lot of people to wrap their minds around that, because we're so used to looking at the Fed controlling interest rates on a day-to-day basis, and we don't understand the constraints on the Fed and the sense in which it's following the market.
So I think what would be another sort of helpful basic question is, let's assume for a minute we're in a sort of stylized light environment, a kind of a semi modern desert island. So we've got stable money. There's no crisis. Life is going about. People are going about their daily business, and in that normal environment, we'll call that like the equilibrium, imaginary equilibrium. What determines interest rates if I go to the bank and I want a loan? What are the things, assuming stable money, stable macroeconomics, nobody's freaking out and hoarding money under their mattress? Um, what are the factors that go into the interest rate I would pay on a loan in a bank?
Well, the standard model, which I guess is appropriate, is that you can think in terms of a sort of supply and demand framework. You could use the phrase supply and demand for loanable funds. That is, how much people are willing to lend at various rates, how much people are willing to borrow at various interest rates. And then there's one interest rate where the amount people are willing to lend is equal to the amount they're willing to borrow. Some people use savings and investment, which is sort of looking at it from a flow, the uses of income. Some income goes into saving. A higher interest rate induces more people to save, and a higher interest rate discourages investment projects. So there's one interest rate where the amount people want to save is the amount people want to invest in capital formation. So there's some notion of a supply and demand framework that would determine interest rates in that environment. And I don't know. So that would be where I would start, I guess.
So I go to the bank and I want to borrow $1,000 for a certain amount of time, let's say a year. I'm going to pay one interest rate. But if I want to borrow that same $1,000 and pay it back over 5 years, I'm going to pay a different interest rate, right? Why is that?
Well, again, it would be supply and demand. Could be people are more reluctant to lend you money for a longer period of time, so you'd have to pay a higher rate, perhaps. Typically, governments, for instance, have to pay a higher rate for longer term loans. Not always, but most of the time. But there's other factors involved as well. The longer term rates are influenced by what people think short term rates will be in the future. So if you think short term rates are about to fall sharply, you might actually be willing to lend money 5 years at a lower interest rate than you'd lend for 1 year because you want to lock into a certain rate before market interest rates fall. In the financial media, that's inverted yield curve. That's when longer term interest rates are lower than short term rates. So it's going to depend on a number of factors. Let me just get back to the central bank question a little bit, because this is so crucial to it. And I don't know if this analogy will help. Maybe it's a little bit of a stretch. But if we're thinking of a Greyhound bus going over the Rocky Mountains and following a mountain road up and over the mountains between two cities, and we think about what determines the path of that bus, I think there's kind of two ways to think about it. One way is to say, well, the path of the bus is determined by the bus driver. He turns the steering wheel, and that tells us whether the bus goes left or right. But at another level, the path of the bus is kind of determined by the road. There's a highway, there's guardrails. The bus driver is very, very reluctant to just drive the bus right off the cliff, right? So you can think of the path of the road as in some sense determining the path of the bus, even though technically speaking, the bus driver moment by moment determines that path by adjusting the steering wheel and could theoretically steer the bus right off the highway into a canyon. And I think monetary policy is kind of like that. We tend to think of the Fed controlling interest rates on a day-to-day basis, adjusting their target interest rate. But at a deeper level, interest rates are really determined by deeper market forces. And the Fed, like the bus driver, kind of has to adjust interest rates to follow along with those market forces, because if it didn't, the economy would sort of fly off the cliff and we would sort of like impeach all the people at the Federal Reserve. We would abandon the monetary system and try something else. That's sort of what happened in the early 1930s when the Fed did such a bad job. We basically changed the rules of the monetary system. But they basically kind of have to follow the economy, even though technically, moment by moment, they're setting short-term interest rates. Just as moment by moment, the bus driver sets the path of the bus by adjusting the steering wheel. And so you can kind of look at the determination of interest rates in two different ways. You can say, well, they're determined by the Fed on a day-to-day basis, or they're determined by deeper market forces that push them up and down. And I can't say either approach is wrong necessarily, but I kind of believe that the deeper market forces view of interest rate determination is more useful. Just as I would say, if I was trying to predict the path of the bus between, Denver and Salt Lake City, I'd kind of look at the road map and say, well, here's where I think the bus is going to go. And I don't care which person is driving the bus. I'm pretty sure they're not going to want to drive it into a canyon. Does that analogy help at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if I could sort of summarize how I think you're explaining it. If we're in a world where all of a sudden, for some reason, some real reason out there in the world, not just a government policy change, or on average, people want to save a lot more. They want to save more money. A big pop star writes a song about how saving money makes you cool, and a new generation is saving more money than anyone. They're spending less, they're saving more. That's going to push interest rates down, irregardless of the Fed.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
eventually the Fed might resist for a week or two, but things will get so bad that the Fed, even though the Fed said 2 weeks ago, we don't think we'll have to cut rates, 2 weeks later they may cut them by 100 basis points, right?
And
let's make it more realistic. Yeah. Let's not talk about a pop star. Let's say people suddenly, for some crazy reason, decide to save more because they think that going out and spending money at restaurants and bars and vacations might cause them to get sick and die.
Right. Yes.
That's why they save more. Right. Now it's no longer such a far-fetched example. What would that do to interest rates? Well, it would depress interest rates very rapidly. And the Fed would probably follow along with cuts in its target interest rate after the market interest rate determined on, market rate on government bonds had already fallen before the Fed cut rates, which is basically happened recently.
So coming to the present moment, which in some respects could just as easily apply to 2008, but obviously we're going through this unbelievable moment in global history right now where day by day we're getting news of governors shutting down, mandating that no one can work and has to except out of their home, and all of this frightening stuff. I'm talking to you from my bedroom. The team at Emergent Order is all working from home right now. It's it's a frightening time. So one of the things that's happening is the Fed is taking these measures. They're announcing that they're letting rates go to zero, and they're doing this quantitative easing, saying 700 billion, 500 billion, whatever. It's hard to keep track and hard to add it up and keep a tally, but they're going to inject all this money into the economy by buying bonds and mortgage-backed securities, and basically taking those assets off the hands of, I guess, banks, and replacing it with cash in the bank, in these banks' accounts. How should we think about what they're doing in the context of this conversation we're having? So, I mean, because obviously there's a group of people who look at that and say, we're going to have hyperinflation. Like, what are they doing? And yet it might be that they're not even doing enough. So help me understand the moment we're in right now where with what the actions the Fed is taking. And I'm gonna ultimately get us to your ideas of nominal income targeting and different ways of thinking about this instead of inflation and interest rates. But I want to stay in that vernacular that people hear and try to understand what's happening now through that lens.
Right. So one aspect of this crisis is increased demand for liquidity. People are more to hold because it's a relatively safe asset. And here, when we think about money created by the Fed, by the way, I should say that there's actually two money the Fed creates. One is currency like you have in your wallet, and the other reserves. Banks keep deposits in reserve. And combined are called the monetary base. So that's the type of money that the Fed controls. And when people say the Fed is printing money or creating money, they're really talking about base money, currency, and bank. So people wish to hold more of those during a crisis, especially bank reserves. And if the Fed doesn't increase the supply when the demand increases, then it's just like any other commodity. When the demand for something goes up, its value will rise. Now you might wonder, well, what would be so bad about a rise in the value of money? That sounds good. Our money would be worth more. But the value of money is inversely related to the price level. So, for instance, if prices double over a period of time through inflation, then the purchasing power of a dollar falls in half. And we've all experienced over long periods of time a gradual increase in the cost of living and a fall in the purchasing power of a dollar. It doesn't buy as much as it used to. We're not really used to dealing with deflation, such as we had in the early 1930s. That's where prices fall and the purchasing power of money rises. So any increase in the value of money is essentially deflation. It's a fall in the price of goods and services. We might actually have that this year, given the current crisis. We'll have to see. But we don't very often have deflation in the modern world. And most economists believe that deflation, at least if caused by hoarding of money, would be harmful to the economy and result in high unemployment and so on. To stave off that from happening, the Fed usually increases the supply of money when there's a rise in the demand for money. So if people are, quote, hoarding money, accumulating money and not wanting to spend it, just sitting on it, the Fed will inject more money into the economy so that the value of money does not rise and the price level does not fall via deflation. So that's their motivation for injecting money both today and also during the big recession around 2008 and 9.
So the money I've got in my pocket, being able to buy more stuff, seems like a good deal.
I know it does.
So why is that not good? Because I just got laid off. Thank God, my money can go a little further. I've got a little bit of savings. I can buy more groceries. I can sustain myself a little longer until this virus passes. Why isn't it a good thing for money
to be worth? Well, you're asking why isn't a lower cost of living a good thing?
Right.
And lower cost of living is a good thing if it's driven by productivity improvements. So if your income is just as high as before and productivity rises and things get cheaper, that's definitely good. But if this change is caused by the hoarding of money, the likely effect will be to reduce your income. And the reason we're getting deflation is also going to spill over in lower income. So people, when they think about inflation, in their own mind, they tend to hold their own income constant. They think, well, I make this much money. If we have inflation, I'm worse off. If we have deflation, I'm better off. And that may be true for some people with secure jobs, maybe a public school teacher or nurse or somebody like that. But for many workers, the deflation will result in unemployment. So their incomes will fall sharply. And that's not a good trade-off from them. The money in their wallet may have a little more purchasing power, but if they've lost their job, they're probably going to be worse off. So it's not that deflation itself is a bad thing. Go back to my phrase, never reason from a price change. It's really deflation, a price change caused by what we would call a lack of aggregate demand, a lack of money in the economy. On the other hand, a deflation caused by productivity improvements, like we sometimes see for computers and cell phones and TV sets, that kind of deflation is beneficial. It means a higher living standard. But the worry the Fed has is of a deflation caused by too little money, which causes people to lose jobs and lose income. And they try to avoid that sort of deflation through injecting enough money in the economy to prevent prices from falling. Think of it from the perspective of a business. When things get cheaper, of course, it's good for consumers. But the companies that are producing those goods, if they have to sell them at lower prices, how can they make a profit, right? Unless their wages unless they can cut their costs, like reduce wages. But if they reduce wages, then that consumer is no longer better off, right? They were mentally holding their income constant when they assumed that a lower cost of living would be a good thing for them. But if their income is falling as part of the thing that's causing lower prices, then it's no longer necessarily a good thing.
Your blog is called The Money Illusion, which I think is just below the surface of what you're talking about. So what is that concept? How does it relate to what you just described?
Yeah, I guess it relates in some ways. The term in economics usually refers to confusion over nominal and real values. So it's convenient for most of us, and myself included, to think in nominal terms.
What do you? So what does nominal mean? What do we
That's
mean
the
by
actual
nominal?
dollar amount. Like if you had I'll give you an example. If you had a job and your boss gave you a 3% raise, that would be the increase in your nominal income. And if during that year inflation were 2%, then we would say you only got a 1% raise in real terms. So the real amount is when you factored out inflation, right? So the nominal amount is the actual amount of, say, a wage increase or an interest rate or something like that. And the real amount is when you take that wage increase and subtract inflation, or you take that interest rate and subtract inflation. And the real amount is supposed to measure the change in your purchasing power. So if you got a 3% raise on your job and inflation was 2%, you'd actually only have 1% more purchasing power, the 3 minus 2. And you'd only be able to buy 1% more goods and services than in the previous year. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now,
So
money illusion is when you confuse the real and nominal. So my claim is that most workers would rather get a 4% raise in a year with 5% inflation than they would a 1% pay cut in a year with 1% deflation.
So to summarize the scenario you just described, in scenario one,
you get a 4% raise and 5% inflation. Now you're actually 1% worse off. Right. If your boss comes to you and says, I'm cutting your pay by 1%, you're likely to take it as a personal insult, even if the cost of living falls 1% that year, because you tend to think in nominal terms. At least that's my claim.
Well, this is very tied to this idea of stickiness.
Right. Sticky wages. And we have a lot of stickiness in the economy, not just wages, but our debt contracts are typically nominal. So when there's a change in inflation, it affects the real amount we owe. Our wage contracts are nominal. So when there's a change in inflation, that affects our real wage. And as a result, this goes back to the very beginning of our talk, when what's special about money? Because all these contracts are denominated in terms of money, changes in the value of money become hugely important because they basically unexpectedly adjust the terms in all sorts of contracts across our whole economy. If you have a deflation that hits unexpectedly, it's suddenly much more expensive in real terms for companies to employ workers at the existing wage contract. It's suddenly much harder for people to repay nominal debts at the negotiated interest rate if there's a sudden deflation of prices.
So I'm an average person and I own my home and I have a mortgage. I get a pay cut of 20%. I go to the grocery store and I see eggs are 20% cheaper. So I'm thinking, oh, well, this is not so bad. I guess it's not really a loss. But then my mortgage comes due and my mortgage contract was written as a 30-year fixed contract and it did not go down 20%.
Yeah, so now you're in trouble. And guess what? Deflation is often associated with major financial crises, people unable to repay debts, banks failing, etc.
So, but you mentioned productivity gain. So,
Well,
frozen
that's,
world where nothing
yeah,
changes, but Apple figures out a way to make twice as many iPhones with the same amount of inputs and same amount of labor, and because Samsung's always competing with them, they drop the price in half. So there's twice as many iPhones at half the price. That's deflationary, right?
but it's
But in a
not
good,
necessarily harmful, right?
but it,
And
yeah.
so, later I know we'll transition to nominal GDP, but let me just talk about this in terms of income because this is really, I think, where it's most useful. Your ability to repay debts is to some extent based on the increase in your nominal income. So, and that's going to be correlated with inflation, but not perfectly. And I'll give you two examples side by side of two countries that had a very similar inflation pattern, but very, very different nominal incomes. So, back around the beginning of the 21st century, Japan had roughly zero inflation and roughly zero increase in nominal incomes. China had roughly zero inflation and roughly 10% a year increase in nominal incomes. And that was because China was rapidly developing during that period. Its productivity was rising, and the rising productivity was allowing workers to earn much, much higher real incomes, maybe about 10% a year higher. So in Japan, because the workers weren't getting any more money in nominal terms, it's a little bit of a struggle to repay the debts. In China, even though they had roughly the same inflation as Japan, roughly zero in those years, their nominal incomes were rising rapidly. And that made it much easier for them to repay debts they had borrowed. So essentially, what was really underlying the rise in Chinese real incomes was productivity gains. And so, in that sense, the low inflation, the zero inflation in China, was not the problem it was in Japan, where there was very little productivity improvement. It was a mature economy that was kind of stagnating at the time. So, because you mentioned it depends on whether the deflation is due to technology or a lack of money in the economy. And that goes back to my phrase, never reason from a price change. We shouldn't start the analysis with, there's deflation, let's see what happens. We should go back one step and ask, why is there deflation? And maybe even another step and say, maybe there's a better variable to look at than inflation to really measure what we're interested in. And in case of the financial markets, it may be that the increase in people's income is more revealing in terms of the ability to repay loans than is the rate of inflation.
So, this this gets us to this concept of nominal GDP or nominal income. So, if I understand this correctly, GDP is this measure of its gross domestic product, and you start with just measuring it in, like we do, in dollar terms. Okay, how much stuff was produced and exchanged in the year, added up, and that gives us our GDP. I don't know what it was this in 2019, 19 trillion or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the nominal. And then So that's the measurable, observable amount of activity. Then you have to try to create the real using this somewhat cockamamie process of saying, well, how many, let's look at this group of things like eggs and houses and cars, but cars got better, so that's a little hard. And man, computers got a lot better, so that's really hard. So they have to make all these adjustments. And so they have
Right.
this inflation rate that they subtract, right? So it's like, oh, in GDP went up 5%, but inflation went up 3%. So real GDP only went up 2. It's kind of like the big picture version of the
Right.
individual story. You
Right. And that's because, nominal GDP is, you can think of it as a first approximation as just all of the gross income earned in the economy by everyone, including firms and individuals. If
so
you add up
what
all the income, that's basically nominal GDP. So if that's growing at 5% a year and we have 3% inflation, then in principle we have 2% more real goods and services produced, with the caveat that it's hard to, measure cost of living precisely.
so when I first so you advocate for thinking about these issues in terms of nominal GDP rather than in terms of inflation.
Right. Most of the things that we use inflation for in macroeconomics, I argue would be better analyzing using the growth rate of nominal GDP in place of the rate of inflation. And that includes the stresses put on a financial system by deflation. It's really falling nominal GDP that puts those stresses on. It includes the so-called welfare cost of inflation. If you think about why inflation is bad, we'd probably be better off using nominal GDP growth as the indicator of whether we have a problem with inflation. And that might be surprising to your listeners, but let me point out that the way a lot of people view inflation as being harmful is not really why economists think it's harmful. So if you asked a lot of people, why is inflation a bad thing? They would say, well, because it lowers my living standard. I have to pay more for stuff. But economists look at the economy as like a sort of a complete system where what you spend is income for someone else. There's this circular flow diagram in the introductory textbooks. All of our spending on one side comes out as income to someone else. So when there's a rise in prices, there's also a rise in income. By itself, price increases don't really make the public poorer. There might be greater poverty created by certain things that cause inflation, like supply shocks. But the inflation itself doesn't really make us worse off. Our prices will go up, but our incomes will go up as well. In the long run, that's true. So then why is inflation a bad thing if it doesn't really make consumers as a whole worse off? And then economists have all these other variables factors they look at, cost of changing prices, tax on savings, all sorts of things that are cited as costs of inflation. But when you look at all those other factors that economists focus on, we'd probably be better off actually looking at the nominal GDP growth rate as our indicator of the so-called cost of inflation on the economy.
So one of the costs that's probably the hardest to understand is from my understanding of it is something that John Maynard Keynes wrote about in the Economic Consequences of the Peace, that it's sort of and that's certainly Hayek and others talk about as well, which is, so we use money prices, the prices out there in the world, to help guide our activities. Like if our company's doing great, we hire more people. If our company's not doing great, we don't, and that tells us something about what people want out there in the world and whether or not what we're offering is what people want. But in this inflation environment, if it's just printing more money and that's the cause of it, it creates some chaos, an
Right.
increased noise to signal ratio, and that's in my understanding, these today, that's maybe the most important cost. Is that the way you think of it too? That it's this, I think Leland Yeager thinks of money like a fluttering veil over the economy, and so it's it's fluttering more, so it's harder to see the truth. Like, is my bottom line telling me that whether or not I should hire or whether or not I should invest? Or is that just because I'm running a construction company and there's a lot of inflation and there's a lot of people scrambling to buy houses and that's all going to come crashing down because it's 2006? Is
Right.
that
That's a part of it. And so you might wonder why, if that's true, if inflation is a problem for that reason, why do I think nominal GDP growth is a better metric for that kind of distortion? So I guess what I would say is that you can think of the economy as having three major sectors: the output of goods and services, the labor market, and the financial system. Those are all important sectors. And in my view, the contracts that create stickiness or slowness in adjustment are most prevalent in labor markets and financial markets. That is, you have labor contracts and financial contracts like bonds, mortgages, and so on that are often relatively long term. Now, it's also true that there's stickiness of prices. Prices don't change every day, they're often set for long periods. But I think the worst problem is in the labor market and in the financial market. And if that's true, then there's sort of like a horse race between two choices. One choice would be, let's stabilize the cost of living in the hope that we have less confusion, less distortions, and so on. The other choice is, let's stabilize nominal GDP or nominal growth at a certain constant rate in the hope that that reduces all these confusions, all this confusion and distortion and so on. And in my view, stabilizing nominal GDP or its growth rate will do a much better job than stabilizing inflation in terms of the labor market and the financial system. For goods, for the goods market, it's probably maybe inflation stabilization might be a little better, or maybe it wouldn't make much difference. But the two big problem markets are the labor market and the financial system. Go back to the Great Recession, for instance, and think about the problems that occurred. Did you find when you went to stores you couldn't find things? No, I mean,
yeah.
typically shoppers had no trouble going to stores. The shelves were full. Maybe not this week, but back during the Great Recession, for instance. So typically, our product markets aren't really that strongly in disequilibrium. Like, there might be a reduction in how much is being sold, but you can usually buy pretty much as you want. The labor market gets way out of equilibrium. Lots of people that want to work just cannot find jobs. And the financial system often gets way out of equilibrium. There's people defaulting on debts because they don't have enough income to repay the debts, banks fail, etc. And if you think that the labor market and financial market instability is the biggest problem that we have with the monetary system, as I do, then you would want to focus on a variable that is most closely linked with stability in those markets. And that variable is nominal GDP growth, not inflation. That goes back to my Japan-China example, where I said that the ability to repay those loans was much higher in China because their income growth was higher. It was nominal GDP that was really telling you the relevant variable in terms of ability to service debt, and the inflation numbers were not very useful. And
So
that's true of labor markets too.
so when I
Wait, one more point. Nominal
okay,
income
go
is
ahead.
the resources that businesses have to pay wages. Inflation is not the resources businesses have to pay wages. It's nominal GDP. It's the revenue that's spent on all goods and services in the economy. When that falls, They lay off workers. There's not enough revenue to support full employment. But you could have deflation because of productivity improvements, and the industry might be booming because the productivity improvements allow you to continue producing and selling at a lower cost. So if we're trying to stabilize the price level, we're kind of missing the boat. Prices can move around for many reasons, but nominal GDP declines are almost a surefire indicator of a problem in the labor market and a problem in the financial system.
So when I first encountered this concept of nominal income as the better way to think about the big macroeconomic stability, like what's happening that's a function of the money supply, or what's happening as a function of policy. It was couched in terms of something that was a pretty old idea, and I didn't realize that how old it was until I sort of looked into this more. That it kind of goes back to this idea of this equation of exchange, right? This sense that there's like a simple tell me about the equation of exchange. I think is it David Hume that first really identified this very abstract concept, but
Certainly,
how
the
does
concept is in his writings on economics, and he had a lot of very extremely astute things to say about um, macroeconomics that can easily be framed in terms of the equation of exchange.
so what is the
Um,
equation of exchange? Because
well,
I
it's
think
it's
it's underneath this conversation in a way.
yeah, it's actually a misunderstood equation. It's sort of like it doesn't really by itself tell us anything in terms of causality, but it's a way of organizing information that makes it easier to think about what we're talking about. So the equation is usually defined as something like M times V equals P times Y. That is the stock of money in the economy times the speed at which it's being spent gives you essentially the total dollar amount of spending in the economy. Um, However, these variables can be defined in many different ways. So a lot of economists will define total spending just in terms of final goods and services. That's nominal GDP. They won't include things bought at a garage sale that are used and aren't, current output. But the basic idea is that if you had, say, $1 billion in the economy, and each dollar was spent once a week, turned over in transactions once a week. Since there's 52 weeks in a year, you'd end up with $52 billion worth of transactions at the end of the year. That's kind of the intuition behind it. So that kind of framing on the right side of the equation, we have the total dollar amount of spending, nominal GDP, let's say. And on the left side, we have the quantity of money in circulation and the speed at which it's being spent. Now, there's a lot of confusion about what this equation means. Is it a theory? Is it an identity? That is a truism. I think it's most useful to view it as an identity, an accounting identity, because we cannot really measure velocity directly. So what we do when we use the equation is we measure nominal GDP and we measure whatever money supply we're interested in. And then the last variable, V, becomes sort of a multiplier factor. We plug in the number that makes the equation true. So for instance, nominal GDP is about 20 trillion now. And if the monetary base is 4 trillion, then the velocity would be 5. 5 times 4 trillion is 20 trillion. And if you organize the data that way, then you would naturally think in terms of there being two ways in which nominal GDP could rise. One would be you'd add more money to the economy, M would go up. The other is the money already there would be spent faster, that is, velocity would go up, or some combination of the two. So it's kind of a way of organizing information, but contrary to what a lot of people assume, it isn't really a monetarist equation. It's not something that shows that the quantity theory of money is true. Just as the analogists,
what
well,
is the quantity theory of money?
that's the theory that if you increase the money supply by a certain percent, prices will go up by the same percent.
Gotcha.
So it's easy to sort of illustrate that theory with the equation to show why we believe it's true, but the equation itself doesn't prove that. Let me give you an analogy so your listeners know what I mean by an identity. Keynesian economists often use a different identity, something like consumption plus investment plus government equals GDP, or sometimes they add in a net export sector too. So you have G plus I plus C plus net exports is GDP. That's just an identity, an accounting relationship, organizing the different kinds of production in the economy. But many people falsely assume it's sort of like shows that more government spending will make GDP go up, because G, government spending, is one of the, or government output technically, is one of the parts of that accounting identity. But of course, it doesn't really prove anything. Maybe if government output goes up, private spending goes down. So we don't really know anything about causality by looking at these equations. And the MV equals PY equation, the equation of exchange, it kind of at first glance looks like if we increase the money supply, nominal GDP will go up. And that's often the case. But it doesn't really prove that, because you could increase the money supply and velocity could go down. And that actually has occurred in some recent periods in history, such as the financial crisis. So it's a way of thinking about the relationship. I think that it is useful in a certain way, but we shouldn't oversell what it tells us.
Well, the other side of so you talked about money and velocity. The other side of it, as I understood it, is summed up as GDP, but it's also broken out into the price level and the
Real GDP.
and real GDP, right?
Right.
So underneath the surface of that. So I think if what I understand to be the benefit, the reason why I brought up Hume and this exchange, and because Hayek writes about this too, he calls it like the spending flow. It also sounds vaguely like Keynes because it's talking about aggregate spending.
Right.
That because we can't really affect, like, the same inflation faces the same problem as velocity. Can't really measure velocity. Our measurement of inflation is kind of nonsense. So if we look at the total picture, nominal income, that's really the thing that we're really able to observe and that we're really concerned about. Inflation may or may not be something we want to deal with or change, right, or use, or have the Fed try to adjust. I mean, I think of this is one of the, so to come back to this present now. So we have this situation where all of a sudden we're all being sent home. Global supply chains are being disrupted. It's hard. It's becoming more expensive in one sense to do business, to get things made. You would think this should actually be causing prices to go up.
Right.
But
yeah, good point.
But that's only right, because it's like, well, man, nobody's working. Well, that means there's less supply of stuff, and we all still need the thing, But obviously, there's all these things are happening at the same time, which is just head scrambling because of the sheer scope of what's happening today.
Right. So,
but in one sense, we would think prices should start to go up, not down.
Right. And what we're implicitly doing when we think that, well, we're probably doing two things. We're remembering that earlier supply shocks, like the oil embargo, did cause inflation to go up. And, crop failures or things that are, reduce our productivity. So we're thinking it's kind of natural for an adverse supply shock, something that reduces our productive capacity to make prices go up. And the other thing we're doing is we're looking at that equation and we're sort of like mentally holding MV fixed. We're saying, well, let's say nothing's going on with the money supply and velocity. Then if real GDP goes down, prices should go up to balance that out, keep the right side of the equation stable. And it's true that if nominal GDP was unchanged, a fall in output should result in higher prices. I would even argue that's desirable. The fact that in this particular crisis, unlike other supply shocks, we're probably going to see inflation fall is itself kind of interesting and worth thinking about, although we might be getting a little ahead of ourselves to talk about that now. But that's one of the things that concerns me about the current situation. It obviously, in an accounting sense, if both prices and real output are going down at the same time, which I expect over the next few months, then the left side of the equation, money times velocity, is also declining. And we have to ask, is that desirable for MV, or in other words, nominal GDP, to be going down during this crisis? Or should we do something on the monetary side to prevent that from happening?
So
Which is
one
an
of the
interesting question.
one of the things that you brought up was these contracts, especially our debts, our mortgages. If we have this sort of deflationary spiral on top of the fact that there's less stuff for us to buy and um, less people working, uh, unless we can renegotiate all of our debts, it's going to hurt even worse. It's going to make a bad situation worse. Is that a
That's
way to
exactly
think
right.
about it? I know it's
Yeah,
I think
so
Hayek calls it like a secondary deflation, or a sort of it's like a second order effect that ends up kicking us
exactly.
while we're down.
Exactly. And here's the problem. Many people don't understand what's going on when there's this secondary effect because they think it's just the primary effect getting worse. Um, I think I'd find that easier to explain by referring back to the previous recession first, because there it's a little bit clearer. In the previous recession, the initial shock was the whole housing subprime mortgage situation, the crash, the banking problems. And then there was a secondary shock of falling nominal GDP, which I would argue was basically unrelated to housing. And it made the recession much worse than it needed to be. But what was widely believed was what happened was that we just had this housing banking crisis and it led to a very severe recession. If you use a medical analogy, most people believe we started with a mild cold and it turned into a bad cold. I argued that we started with a cold and it turned into pneumonia, went from a viral infection to a bacterial infection. And that needed completely different medicine than would a viral infection. So, what we had back in the Great Recession was a decline in the housing market that by itself was not severe enough to cause a big recession. In fact, for 2 years, the housing market declined in almost in half with very little impact on the unemployment rate because housing is only in the 3 to 6% of GDP range. So workers lost jobs building houses, but they went over and worked in other areas like commercial construction and manufacturing services, etc. Then, starting in the middle of 2008, MV, total dollar spending, started to fall. And this led to a decline in many industries in the economy, not just housing. And it made the recession dramatically worse than it had been in the early part of the downturn. Unemployment then rose very, very rapidly. And we had many more bankruptcies, even unrelated to some prime mortgages. In fact, in the end, we actually lost far more. We had far more bank failures due to default on business loans than we did to subprime mortgages. Most of the bank failures in America were caused by business loans defaulting, and I would argue because of the fall in nominal GDP, which made it much harder for businesses to repay loans. So
If
the housing was the trigger, the primary shock, but the secondary shock turned into something much, much bigger.
So this one of the ways I think about this is uh, is a I kind of hate this analogy because of some of the ways it gets misused. Like the idea that there's a hydraulic system in an economy, but
Mm-hmm.
it's an interesting analogy in this case, which is if you have a set of pistons that are all connected in like a closed loop filled with air. I love Legos that you can do this with the little Lego Technic pistons.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the total height of all the piston heads will always be the same, because if you push down on one, another one will pop up because the air will move into the other one. So the total height, if you measure all the heights of the little piston heads, they should technically always be at the same height. And that's the way I think of your idea of this nominal GDP, that this income in the economy is the same. And so, all right, housing goes down, but people are able to move into other industries, other sectors expand. Um, if Apple gets good at making more iPhones and the price of iPhones goes down, that means that the buyers of iPhones have money to spend in other places, and so you have this system of relative prices at work, which is why markets are good. Markets let
Mm-hmm.
you decide. Markets are like this giant decision engine that through prices of, do we need more respirators now? Well, yes, we do, because the prices are going up. That's how we know we need more. Um, but what
Exactly.
um, you're describing is the air is getting let out of that hydraulics, and so now, I don't know. Okay, so now the air is coming out of the one for the housing, but none of the other ones are seeing the prices go up, so nobody's hiring these housing people anymore. They were, and now they're not, because now they're seeing their incomes also either be flat or go down, and we don't know. So there's no one getting that signal that says pick up the slack, or hey, there's opportunities here, there's some people here you can hire, there's some consumers that you can pitch your wares to. It creates this like downward pressure that each individual piston doesn't know how to interpret when they look out into the world and say, what's happening? Is that, does that
Yeah,
make
that's
sense?
right. Yeah, let me. That's exactly right. That's a good analogy. Another way of looking at this, which is really along the same lines but a different framing, is to kind of think about it in terms of like how a free market economy is supposed to work. Like, let's say you were a believer in free market economics and you wanted to sell the idea to the public. What kind of nominal GDP path would you want to have? In all probability, it would be easier to sell your ideas if nominal GDP or the growth rate was stable. Like, for instance, you would say, don't bail out General Motors, right? Let them go bankrupt. Well, that's a hard argument to make if there's a lot of unemployment. But if you're keeping nominal GDP growth stable, then the money that was spent on General Motors cars would be spent on some other product, right? You're keeping total spending stable. So you could think of workers being reallocated out of declining industries into growing industries. But if nominal GDP falls, it's harder to make that argument because there may not be employment opportunities in other growing industries to offset the decline there. So it's hard to argue against bailouts. It's hard to argue against tariffs because it seems like imports are costing jobs. But again, if you keep nominal GDP stable, then any losses in one sector due to imports will be offset by gains somewhere else. It's hard to argue against government make work projects to put people to work if nominal GDP is falling, because what will the unemployed do otherwise? But if you keep nominal GDP growing at a stable rate, then there'll be enough jobs out there for workers losing jobs in one sector to find jobs in some other sector. So you don't need like fiscal stimulus to create jobs because your monetary policy is already promoting stable growth in total spending in the economy. So many of the arguments made that go against free market economics for bailouts of industries, for protectionism, for government make work projects, etc., are basically arguments that assume that the market economy doesn't work in terms of providing employment opportunities. And essentially, the whole classical notion of opportunity cost, like if you spend money on something, there's an opportunity cost that we can't do something else with that money. It's actually hard to make that argument in a depressed economy because people will say, well, yeah, we're spending all this money on a government project, but if the government wasn't doing it, the resources would just be idle. They wouldn't be used somewhere else. So if you keep nominal GDP growing at a stable rate, then it sort of makes classical economics true. Ideas like Say's law, supply creates its own demand, become true in an economy where nominal GDP growth is kept stable. And opportunity cost becomes a valid concept in that kind of economy. So in my view, if you kind of think of it in that framing, like what kind of monetary policy would make it most easy to argue for classical economic principles like free markets and creative destruction and opportunity cost, it's stable nominal GDP growth.
I am a huge believer that the Say's law of markets is arguably the single most important concept in economics outside of what we're talking about. The idea that the way I like to think of it is, I know you said supply creates its own demand. Shame on you, Scott. That's a very Keynesian summary of Say's law. But the way I think of it is, in order to buy things, I must make an income. That my actual income is the product of my production. That I have to do something for somebody. I have to create something. I have to provide a service. And then I get this receipt for doing so, and that is what allows me to demand other things. And this is all, we're all, at some level, I feel like even all the ways that economics gets framed masks the sense in which an economy is people trying to serve each other and exchanging their services. These flows and these circular flows and these macro frameworks often just mask that, and it turns into a focus on spending instead of a focus on service and creation. And
Right.
I mean, how do you think? Do you think that's a fair criticism at the most basic level of thinking for the I mean, the way I something I personally harp on every Christmas is all the obsession about whether or not Christmas spending is good. This whole idea that consumption grows the economy, when it by definition is the using up of what the economy has produced. These all feel connected to me, and it's like giant ball of fallacies that gets in the way of understanding what makes prosperity happen.
And I think in modern complex economic systems, it becomes harder to see this connection. It's probably easier for people in, I don't know, 200 years ago in a small American town to see how it all fits together because they're producing things for each other and trading, and they see the connection between production and income. And a little bit maybe in the modern economy with some of these things like Uber drivers, where you really see the connection between, production and income. But in the modern complex economy, all sorts of fallacies creep in that wouldn't be a problem in those simple economies like America in 1820 in a little village. And three that are very pernicious are that trade, international trade, immigration, and automation are all bad for employment. So there's this perception that imports cost jobs, automation costs jobs, immigrants steal jobs from domestic citizens. And these are hard to dispense with, but it becomes easier to push back against these ideas if we maintain stable growth in nominal GDP. We make the economy more like that little village in 1820, where it's obvious that if you do something to make your little blacksmith shop more productive, it's good for the economy, right? But in a complex economy where people are hired by big firms and work for people they don't even see and so on, and they're one cog in this big machine, often it's harder to see what's truly going on, this interrelationship you talk about between production, what we can produce, and what we're able to consume. And that's where a lot of economic fallacies crop in, which lead to bad government policies.
So to come back to our present situation where the coronavirus and the government's response to it, which may be necessary, may be overblown. It's hard to know, and it will be probably impossible after the fact to make a convincing argument in either direction. Because if things turn out better than predicted, every action that was taken will be defended as being contributing to the good outcome. And if things are worse than expected, everyone will say we should have done more. And it's like it's the classic problem with complex systems like a whole society. We just never really know. It's complicated. But one of the things that I'm struggling with in trying to understand how to apply your insights, this focus on income as our macroeconomic sort of thermostat, is how does the Fed? So the Fed is measuring nominal GDP, or some government agencies measuring it imperfectly somehow. They're getting prices in with some amount of delay to generate these reports about what nominal GDP is, or what it was last month, or with some delay. And now the Fed has this money supply that it's growing and shrinking by buying and selling assets. And then it's also impacting it by whether or not it pays interest, which keeps money parked at the Fed versus not parked at the Fed. But the relationship between the activities of what the Fed does, how much should it buy now, versus the actual outcome of nominal GDP, which is this big estimate of the activities in the economy as a whole. How are they supposed to do that? How are they supposed to know how much money to put into the economy to try to counteract or supply the demand for money? The people are, and I've got sort of a second question, which I'll ask, even though it's not quite related, but I'll ask it anyway. Is, I understand people going to the bank and taking cash and taking it out of the bank and putting it in their mattress. But how much of that is happening versus, keeping money in a savings account, or, are there other kinds of demand for money besides literally pulling cash out of the bank that is happening, that we can understand that there's this increased demand for money? Like, how do we know that there's such a big increased demand for money? And how does the Fed know that it's adequately countering it? I guess that's my summary of my two questions in one.
Okay.
I really hit you with a lot there. Maybe let's start off with how do we know that, like, how is this happening? How is this demand for money actually being manifest right now?
Yeah. Because the first question you asked me, I think itself is a two-parter in terms of how does the Fed know what to do, I think. So, well, there's a couple problems here. I'll have to give a little bit of a long answer, but you can interrupt me at any time. One is, what should the Fed be doing? That is, what is its target? Like, am I correct that they should target nominal GDP growth at 4% a year, let's say? And then the second part of the question is, well, if that is the proper goal, or if 2% inflation is the proper goal, how would they know how much money is appropriate to hit that goal? Is that right? Is that sort of the two parts to your
I,
question?
yeah, I
What is the
think,
proper goal, and how do they know what's the appropriate policy to reach that goal?
yeah, I think, I was sort of assuming, like, take as an assumption that some stable growth of nominal income. I'm going to leave aside for maybe another time why it should grow rather than just be stable.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe like you're framing it in these two ways. So yeah, so A, why choose a growth target for nominal GDP, and then B, how do they hit it? How do they know what to do to hit it?
Okay, so um, my argument for nominal GDP targeting is, as I indicated earlier, I believe that would best stabilize the labor markets and the financial system, which is the two big problems we tend to have during a major crisis. That is, we have high unemployment and we have a lot of debt defaults and bank failures and so on. So, one argument I make is that with stable nominal GDP growth, we'd have a more stable economy, not these waves of exuberance and crash that we see in the financial system, and unemployment would not shoot up to 10% as it did in 2009. So that's the logic of nominal GDP targeting. Um, I believe in the Great Recession period, for instance, that about 90% of the recession was the fall in nominal GDP, and the other 10% was unemployment caused by workers leaving housing construction and going to other sectors. Now, the current crisis we're facing is a very unusual one. It's a shock unlike anything I've ever seen. It's not one that's easily fixed by getting people to spend more money, because the real problem is people are basically reluctant to go out and go on cruises and flights and hotels and restaurants and all this. So we may see a fairly severe drop in output, which you can view as, in one sense, as like a fall in productivity, or you could view it as just, a reluctance to spend money and a need to reallocate our um, economy towards other sectors. So, well, maybe 90% of the Great Recession was caused by the fall in nominal GDP. This time around, even if we stabilize nominal GDP growth, I want to warn your listeners that I think that would only maybe solve 30% of the problem or something. That is, a lot of what we're going to face this year is sort of unavoidable pain due to the way we're reacting to the crisis by shutting down a lot of activities for reasons of social distancing and so on.
To
And that
to put
can't
that
be
another
fixed.
way, like, when we're not, I mean, this in a way is kind of sort of tying into the Say's Law idea. If we're not making stuff, we are getting poorer. If we're
Right, we're
sitting
getting
at
poor.
home, yeah, we're sitting at
Exactly.
home eating and consuming our homes and using up stuff, but we're not making stuff. The society is getting poorer. There's no,
Right,
we could triple the amount of money we all have sitting on laying in our sitting around, and it doesn't matter. We don't have as much stuff. We're
right.
worse off.
But we don't want to amplify the problem unnecessarily by having the amount of money spending fall, or at least fall excessively. Now, even if you don't accept my view of nominal GDP targeting, almost everybody should agree, I would think, that we don't want inflation to be falling in this crisis. You mentioned earlier that normally during a supply shock, inflation will increase. And that's been the experience in the US during like the oil embargo and so on. But this time around, even though we have an adverse supply shock, it looks like inflation is going to be falling this year. That's going to put even more pressure on borrowers. So we have a situation where it would already be difficult for people to service debts, and there would already be a rise in defaults and bankruptcies. But if we let inflation and even nominal GDP fall, that's going to make it worse. So my preference would be a monetary policy that tried to promote nominal GDP growth at least for next year, say 2021. I mean, I don't think there's anything we can do about the next month or two. Everything will go in shutdown in many industries. So, but what I'm fearful of is that a lot of indicators in the financial markets are suggesting that investors think things will be very depressed for many years to come, even after, say, a vaccine were developed. And that's where monetary policy can help. If you have a monetary policy that promotes nominal GDP growth, then once the acute medical crisis is over and people are at least to some extent able to get out of their houses and do things again, it will promote a faster recovery if we have adequate nominal spending in the economy to create a reemployment of workers. And just as we failed to reemploy workers quickly enough in the Great Recession, even once we'd solved the banking crisis, due to a lack of nominal spending, we could fail to get an adequate recovery from this acute crisis right now if we do not have a monetary policy able to promote nominal spending growth at a decent rate, at least over the medium term. We can kind of set aside on a shelf what can be done in the short term, which is very debatable. So my goal would be a monetary policy that promotes nominal GDP growth, at least over the medium term, to reduce the amount of debt stress on borrowers, reduce the amount of unemployment over the medium term once the most acute phase of the medical crisis is over. And so that calls for in my view, a different monetary policy. And then the second part of your question is, how do we know how to do that? But first of all, do you see the framing I'm making, that this crisis is a little more, quote, real and less monetary than some other crises we've had? In the past, it was often just a question of you'd inject money in the economy and people would go out and spend more. I'm less optimistic this time that that would work in the very short run because of all this social distancing. But I do feel we are in danger of it dragging for a long period, and still think things can be done on the monetary side to create more bullish expectations for next year. And that would help support some of the financial markets that are crashing, because they're crashing partly because they think the economy will be bad in 2021, 2022, and so on, not just this year. If it was just this year, the markets would not be sending the signals they are. The long-term bond yields, the stocks, and all the other indicators are for quite a long period of recession right now.
And this sort of gets, so before we get to this role of expectations and we can kind of end our conversation there, I want to just try to understand how the Fed, being the monetary authority, would know that they're putting in enough money or too much, or is it a little bit of there's just this sort of delayed reaction, and so they put in a bunch of money and then they measure nominal GDP and then they say, oh, we overshot, we pull back a little this time, and there's just you got to live with some lag because there's no like instant real time indicator. It's not like it's almost like is it like they're sort of controlling a remote control car that's got a sort of delay on the controls, and so you're overshooting and undershooting, but you're just trying to stay on target? How do they know what to buy and how much to buy? Like that connection there is the thing that most confuses me about.
Right. Yeah. So
I think it applies equally to inflation, right? It's probably it's not really a different problem than how do they know how much to put in to try to keep inflation at 2%. But how do you?
Yeah, it's a similar problem. The metaphor might be steering a large tanker or ocean liner, a very large ship, because there the movement of the boat responds rather slowly to the movement of the steering wheel, compared to if you turn the steering wheel on a Ferrari or something and the car responds very quickly. So that creates a difficulty. But before answering that question, it might be useful to briefly point out that the Federal Reserve can increase prices in nominal GDP. Although you might not question that, there's a lot of articles out there talking about the Fed being out of ammunition or They've
Okay.
already cut interest rates to zero. There's nothing more they can do. So let's be clear that central banks have an almost infinite ability to create inflation, at least in a technical sense. Now, there may be political constraints on a central bank, especially in Europe where it's very complicated, but in a technical sense, a central bank can create almost an unlimited amount of money and therefore spending and inflation or whatever nominal variable they want to increase if they're determined to do so. They never really run out of ammunition unless they run out of paper and ink to print new money with, which obviously won't happen. So why do so many people believe that the Fed is out of ammunition if it clearly is not out of ammunition? One reason is they think monetary policy is interest rates. So they think it's cutting interest rates. And then when interest rates are cut to zero, they think the central bank's out of ammunition. But actually, monetary policy is about the supply and demand for money. So as long as the central bank can do things to increase the supply of money or reduce the demand for money, they can do expansionary monetary policies. They can only reduce the demand for money so much, but there's really no limit in principle to how much the supply of money could be increased. So my preferred policy would be for the Fed to commit to do whatever it takes, inject as much money into the economy as necessary, buying assets with this newly created money in order to create market expectations of adequate growth in nominal GDP or inflation if they choose a 2% inflation target. So the exact target isn't as important right now as just having a whatever it takes approach, committing to buy as many assets as necessary with newly created money so that the market begins to expect 2% inflation or 4% nominal GDP growth. Now, we have market indicators of inflation expectations, and they're well under 2%. So it's very likely inflation will be below 2% over the next few years. That means monetary policy is not sufficiently expansionary. They need to inject more money. But by itself, that's not really the most important step they could take now. The most important step is to do what's called level targeting, which means you set a trend line for either prices or nominal GDP, and you say, if we miss, we'll promise to come back to that trend line in the future. So let's say that their target path was for prices to grow at 2% a year. And 2 years out, it'd be 4% higher, 3 years out, 6%, a little more with compounding. But basically, that would be the idea. That would be the trend line they're looking for. If during a given year, prices only rise 1%, now you're 1% below that trend line of 2% growth. So you commit to catch up to the trend line with faster than 2% growth until you're back on that trend line. That's called level targeting, and that's the single most powerful thing the Fed could do right now to restore confidence in the economy. Switch to level targeting. Even better than level targeting inflation would be level targeting nominal GDP growth at, say, 4% a year. And so you have a trend line going out at 4% a year for nominal GDP growth. And if you fall below that in the short term, you commit to come back up to that trend line over the following few years.
So how
and how do they know whether they've done enough?
Yeah, exactly.
Use market indicators. So look at the markets, see what they're forecasting. If markets are forecasting that you're going to fall short of your goals, do more. If the markets are forecasting excessive growth in nominal GDP or inflation, do less. So the market is probably the single best guide the Fed has. The analogy I use here, if we go back to steering and so on, is the central banks like the Fed have been for too long focusing too much on past economic data. So they'll look at what inflation has been or nominal GDP has been in the past, and they'll make adjustments on that basis. but that would be like steering your car by looking at the rear view mirror to see if you're drifting off the road. A much better way to steer your car is look ahead down the road and steer towards the objective, the point further down the highway. So the markets, the financial markets, are going to give you an indication of where the markets think you're going in terms of inflation or nominal GDP growth. And if we don't have good indicators, create new ones. I've been recommending creating a nominal GDP futures market, for instance, which would provide valuable information to the Federal Reserve.
So, why do you believe, so the road analogy is great, but the road analogy has the benefit of there being an actual physical road that lies ahead,
Right.
that if you look forward, you see. But what
Right.
you're talking about is predictions about an uncertain future by people placing bets. And I realize that I'll sort of say people who are actually putting money on bets for the future are worth more than people who just go on cable news and blab about what they think the future is going to be, because at least they've got skin in the game. But even so, why do you have any confidence that that's useful information, these bets about the future? Like, why is that?
Well,
I mean, is it
I
just
think
like is it just the least worst thing for the Fed to use?
yeah,
Why have
it's the
confidence
least
in it?
worst. Well, first of all, I don't have confidence in the sense that I think the market is always right. I mean, the market is often wrong. I think it's the least bad forecasting tool we have. It's not that look, like if there's a point spread on the Super Bowl and one team is expected to win by 4 points, if you ask me what do I think will happen in the Super Bowl, I don't actually think that team will win by exactly 4 points, but that would probably be my least bad guess. Like I can't think of any other guess that would be more likely to be true. And I think that's kind of how markets work. But because of that objection, I've suggested that there's another way to bring the market into the picture that allows the central bank to disregard the market forecast or override it if it's worried that for some reason the market is off course. And this one's a little bit tough to explain. It requires your readers are familiar with concepts like futures markets. But one way to do this would, and I call this the guardrail approach to get back to the driving. Um, One way to do this would be to say that the central bank commits to go long or short on nominal GDP futures contracts at a price a little bit above or below the target level. So if the target is 4% growth in nominal GDP, they commit to go short on a contract at 5% growth and long on a 3% contract. In other words, they say we're willing to bet market participants that nominal GDP growth will be between 3 and 5%. And if you think it's going to be outside that range, you can take a bet with us and we'll take the other side of that bet.
So
Now, if nobody bets with the central bank, that's fine. That means the market is confident that growth will be within that range. But if most people in the market think we're clearly going to be above 5% or clearly below 3%, and there's times where markets clearly feel the Fed is off course, then all the bets will pile up on one side. And then the central bank has a decision. They can either take that bet with the market if they're sure they're doing the right thing and the market is wrong, if they think they know better than the market, or they might look at that and say, maybe we're off course because everybody's betting it's going to be outside this range and they're all betting in one direction. Maybe we should nudge policy so that bets are more balanced, so that roughly half the people think we're going to overshoot and roughly half the people think we're going to undershoot. Even though I use the term guardrails, another metaphor that maybe is more useful is the beeping noise a truck makes when it's backing up and approaching an object, right?
yeah,
So if there's all these bets in the market against the central bank, that's kind of like a warning that they're probably off course. Now, the driver of the truck can say, well, I think that beeping mechanism is wrong. I don't see anything in my rear view mirror. I'm going to keep backing up. They can override that. But if they crash into something, the passenger next to them might ask, why did you ignore that beeping sound? And the Fed could ignore the markets, but if they go way off course and there's a recession or high inflation in the other direction, Congress might say, why did you ignore all those market signals that you were way off course? What made you confident that you knew more than the market about where nominal GDP was growing? So, in that kind of regime, there's still theoretically 100% discretion for the central bank to ignore markets if the central bank is confident that the markets are wrong. But as a practical matter, let's face it, if the markets were piling up overwhelmingly on one side, the central banks would be terrified about losing a lot of bets and being embarrassed. So, as a practical matter, they would conduct policy so that they're probably in that range where there's bets occurring in both directions. And that's because, as you know, in reality, central banks do not know better than the market where the economy is likely to go in the future. But again, my proposal would allow formally central banks to ignore markets if they think markets are irrational or subject to manipulation or bouts of hysteria or anything of that sort. So it does address that criticism, and but I think it does so in a way that, when you look at it realistically, central banks, in fact, do understand that if the markets were all lined up on one side, they would have a problem.
So the last question I have for you, Scott, is why should the Fed buy assets, which sounds little like
Yeah,
communism.
right. Good
why,
question.
why
Well,
shouldn't if the Fed wants to increase the money supply, why not just
yeah,
have the
I don't.
Treasury print tons of dumb money, drive around the country, and put it in people's front door? And there you go. There's some more money. It's not debt. I didn't buy your house, and now the Fed owns my house, or buy
Yeah, but
Apple
that's
stock, and now
exactly
the
the
Fed owns Apple stock. Like, why buy assets instead of just create money and disperse it?
right. So that's why monetary stimulus versus fiscal stimulus. What I would argue is, because what you're talking about in the what you mentioned, giving away the newly created money, is really combined monetary fiscal stimulus. Fiscal stimulus is costly because it imposes a burden on future taxpayers. Now, it may not look that way, because in your example, you're giving the money away. It wasn't necessarily any sort of debt for the government, but in practice, it probably is a debt. And here's why. When the crisis is over, the demand for money will be much lower. So all that money you injected has to be pulled out of circulation. If you've given it away, you have to borrow a lot of money to buy it back from the public.
Hmm.
On the other hand, if the central bank injects money into the economy by buying assets, and I prefer they buy government bonds, by the way, then when they have to remove the money from circulation, they can sell off the government bonds they bought, and there's no net cost to future taxpayers from monetary stimulus. Fiscal stimulus imposes a burden on future taxpayers, which hurts the economy in the long run. So fiscal stimulus is much more costly than monetary stimulus. It may seem like there's a free lunch, let's give everybody $1,000 or whatever. But if that seems to be too good to be true, it's because there is. There's always a opportunity cost involved in fiscal stimulus.
So,
And it may seem in the short run, I do understand the argument for it. Like with interest rates at zero, there's really no burden on the debt. And it looks like they could inject the money for a considerable period of time, and it wouldn't be a burden on taxpayers. But unless interest rates stay at zero forever, and that's a special case, but unless interest rates stay at zero forever, it really is a future tax burden.
well,
Uh,
I want to make sure I understand the way, because you're talking about, I guess what I think it's like helicopter money, just putting
Right.
money, just the Fed going into every bank account and adding a zero.
Right.
Forget having to print a bunch of money, since nobody's paying with cash. Everybody's got a credit card or a
Hmm.
debit card. Um, I want to make this is a little this is a little confusing to me. So I want to make sure I understand the difference. If the if Uncle Sam, if the Trump administration cuts everybody checks out of the Treasury and it comes out of the federal budget, and they have to go out and borrow money, even if they borrow it at zero, they've borrowed it from someone that's expecting the money back. So that's a debt. There's a creditor that has to be repaid, even if all they're going to be repaid is the exact amount they lent, zero interest, or even negative interest. They're just happy that they're going to get something back in the future instead of nothing. So that's a debt, and I understand that. And of course, you're going to have to pay it back. So if you cut everybody $2,000 checks and they spend it on food and clothing and car washes and whatever, well, that money, that those resources are gone, and their future incomes are going to need to be garnished in the form of taxes to pay back the creditor that lent the money. But how is the Fed creating new money? I mean, you explained it, but it doesn't sound the same thing as fiscal stimulus with debt finance. It
Yeah, it's
sounds
a
like
little hard to see because it's done differently. I'm trying to think what the best way to explain this.
so. Let me try to
So
maybe let
I'm
me make sure
I'm
I've heard you correctly. So you're saying, like, okay, the Fed increases the money supply in every single American's bank account. They just they put it in. They just do a digital deposit. It's all, and now we've all got a bunch more money in our bank accounts. And so now, and then um, the coronavirus thing comes to an end, and we all get back out there into the world, and now we're starting to see inflation because of the increase in the money supply, the long run effects. Now, hey, I can go out and I can buy two iPhones, and there's not enough iPhones to go around, and so the price goes up, and we're bidding up prices with all this extra money, which is the way it would work. It doesn't just pop up; we bid it up, right? Um, so you're saying that the only way to take the money out to curb that inflation that was created would be what?
well,
Why couldn't the Fed sort of why does it have to be debt like? You
well,
could, you know,
you need the resources to pull the people that got all that money that you gave them aren't going to give it back to you for free. They they won't they won't be grateful and say, "Well, you can have it back now for free." You'll have to buy it back.
right.
And the probably the in the immediate sense, the way you'd buy it back is you'd give them bonds. So now you've got a debt. And let's put a number on this in terms of how long, so it's easier for me to make my point kind of mathematically, if you will. Let's say that this cash is injected, and after 3 years, it would start to cause inflation. So we start pulling it out, and we buy it back by giving people bonds, okay, after 3 years. Then what you've really done here is you've financed this fiscal program of giving everybody $1,000 for first 3 years with cash and with government bonds for all the years after those 3 years. And this is maybe why some of the people you talked to kept insisting money was debt. If there's really a commitment to keep the purchasing power of money relatively stable and not to allow high inflation, then there has to at some level be a commitment to pull that money back out of circulation if it would threaten to raise prices a lot. So when monetary injections are temporary to meet liquidity demands in a crisis and keep, you know, GDP from falling, eventually that money will have to be sort of converted into debt. And that will then be a burden. You'll have to start paying interest on that debt. Not immediately, but at some point in the future. Now, what I just said, I suppose, is not true if interest rates stayed at zero forever. But then that raises the interesting question of how much debt could you issue at zero interest rates before the public got tired of it. But in any case, it
I
seems
see what
like
you're
it's
saying.
different
So
from
the
fiscal stimulus, but it's actually giving everybody $1,000 of newly created money is really equivalent to two separate operations. One operation is monetary. The government increases the money supply by $1,000 per person by buying bonds. And the second part of that is the government takes that newly created money and gives it away, which is fiscal policy. And you combine those two actions into one, expansionary, monetary, and fiscal at the same time. But whenever there is a fiscal element to it, it does create a sort of debt obligation, an obligation that future taxpayers have to meet, even if it's in the distant future. And doing it that way, rather than just having the Treasury borrow the money and give it away where the debt is more obvious, it doesn't change it to have it done with newly created money. You're just sort of dividing up that operation into two components. One is monetary and one is fiscal. But as long as you're giving the money away, it's radically different for the long-term government finances than if the Fed just buys bonds with newly created money and holds that asset so they can reverse the transaction later when they have to remove the money. There's nothing that's the opposite of a helicopter. There's no big vacuum cleaner that sucks
right.
the money back out of circulation. It has to be
This is
buyback. It's easy to inject the money, to drop it out of a helicopter. It's much harder to get it back.
this is the first time I've heard anyone explain the way that downside works. And why can't I mean, in one sense, there is a reverse helicopter in the form of the taxing authority, right? So could the
Right.
Treasury could
Right, and that's what
tax
I mean
people's
by
money,
a burden. You
right?
tax the money back, and so that extra money at first would probably be removed with some government borrowing, but then maybe over time we become more thrifty or conservative and say we need to sort of pay off some of the national debt. But even if you never pay off the national debt, you need to service the interest on the national debt with future taxes. So there's never a free lunch for any sort of giveaway of money. And by the way, I'm not trying to argue against any kind of government spending in this crisis. There may be good arguments for unemployment compensation and various things on humanitarian grounds. All I'm trying to do is, in a technical sense, convince your listeners that there's no sort of free lunch here. We can't just give away a lot of money and assume there won't ever be any cost to this program.
So to wrap up this marathon conversation that I think has helped me understand these issues with a lot more clarity, where do you think the Fed they've certainly seemed to act relatively quickly. What's your sense of what they've learned from 2008 and whether or not they're going to allow a bad real world situation to be turned into a second phase nominal disaster?
Well, I think they learned some things from 2008, and this was the longest expansion in history until the recent crisis. I think the Fed did a good job with the trade war last year, and I think normally there would have been a recession last year, except for things they learned from 2008. But having said all that, I don't believe the Fed has been sufficiently expansionary. You say it looks like they've done a lot. If you think in terms of the Fed following interest rates down to zero rather than pushing rates down to zero, it's no longer clear they've actually done that much. They've been more reactive than proactive. Now, I don't want to be too critical. They've moved quickly and perhaps done more than they would have done in the past. And they're facing an unprecedented crisis, a very different type of crisis from what we usually face during a recession. So I'm willing to cut them a lot of slack. There's only so much you can do, obviously, in this sort of a medical emergency where simply throwing money at the problem doesn't maintain full employment. But having said all of that, I still believe they need to do considerably more to improve expectations for the out years, next year, the year after. And that consists of switching to level targeting, which means promising to come back to the trend line when they miss, number one. And number two, committing to do whatever it takes in terms of asset purchases so that markets expect them to get back on that trend line over the next few years. And I'm worried that this recession and recovery may be worse than necessary, even after the acute medical crisis is over, because of the secondary effects we've been talking about, the excessive hoarding of money, the bearish expectations, which reduce nominal spending in the economy. And that's my focus is right now, trying to encourage monetary policy, which can't do much to address the immediate crisis, to do things that will make the recovery more robust by a very aggressive policy of keeping expectations of future spending higher.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for taking all this time with me and for being out there now for more than a decade advocating for what I think, is maybe hard for folks to understand at the just basic level, but you stay at it to try to make it understandable in so many different ways, and I really appreciate it. You've helped me understand things in innumerable ways, even in this conversation.
Well, thank you very much, John. I enjoyed the conversation, and maybe we can do it again sometime.
So hopefully under better circumstances.
That's right.
Oh, all right. Thanks, Scott. Thanks for listening to the Emergent Order podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. If you're interested in being a guest, shoot us an email at podcast@emergentorder.com. Our producer is Jesse Bennett. Thanks again, and speak to you next time.